Welcome back for the latest edition of Discussing Serial. This week we have not one, but two episodes of Serial to discuss, so I've brought in both of my guest commentators, Oriana Pollock of Military Times and Tony Lombardo of Army Times. So thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks. Last week, the Serial crew surprised us with two new episodes, which both had a lot of interesting information and some pretty big revelations in them. As the podcast takes a closer look at whether Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl is telling the truth about why he walked off his post, we learned two key things. Bergdahl in 2006 was discharged from the Coast Guard basic training after having a mental breakdown, and he since has been diagnosed with schizotypal personality disorder, which is a pretty serious diagnosis. So do these things help explain things about Bergdahl, or do they raise more questions? Arguably both. Oriana, maybe you can give us a glimpse into his mindset.
Well, we hear in this episode what Bowe Bergdahl's idea of warrior was. And we also hear from him that he had a perceived notion of a higher moral understanding, and he wanted this from everybody around him. But in terms of combat, he thought of himself as like a samurai, as a mercenary, and you hear from members in the Army that this idea of isolationism doesn't really apply to a huge community like the Army.
Absolutely. And so speaking of the Army, there's a lot of questions about should he have even been there? Should he have been recruited? Tony, can you talk a little bit about how did he end up in the Army after being discharged from the Coast Guard with, amid the circumstances that he was?
So at the time that Bergdahl was recruited, the Army needed troops, and there were more waivers granted, and recruiters had a lot of pressure on them to meet quotas. Because Iraq and Afghanistan is happening. So it's not surprising to me that Bergdahl was able to get in, but the benefit of this being raised now is that clearly it's a valid question, should he have been screened earlier? And I think the Army is going to take a hard look at itself and some of its policies, and when we need to grant waivers again sometime in the future, I think it will be done differently.
It seems that information sharing was also an issue here. I think that they said in the episode that they didn't really get all of the files from the Coast Guard, and in the Coast Guard files was a recommendation from a psychiatrist that he needed to get a waiver from a psychiatrist before re-enlisting. The Army says they didn't get that, so maybe that would be part of the next waiver program. Maybe they'll be able to benefit from better information sharing.
I think that's definitely a goal to strive for. I mean, I think the general public listening to Serial will be surprised by this fact, but for those of us who know the military well, understand there are tons of different systems out there, and some very antiquated that never talk to each other. So training, records, psychological screening, sometimes those things don't link up. So it's not surprising, but hopefully some good will come out of this.
Absolutely. Okay, a lot of really interesting stuff here for sure. We would love to hear your thoughts, so please share by commenting on our story at federaltimes.com or by emailing me, acorin@federaltimes.com. You can also tweet me at CorinAmber on Twitter. We'll see you back here after episode 9 for the next installment of Discussing Serial. Thank you for joining us.